Hello everyone to this webinar about your career and career boost with a focus on how to scale up your communication and soft skills. I'm Chris and I'll guide you through a short outline what I think is good to do as the year starts and you can kind of look forward and plan ahead. And briefly about me so you can kind of understand where I'm coming from. I used to be a scientist. I did a PhD and some postdoc, some research with a focus on machine learning and data science. From there, I became a founder and I started a company building software solutions that analyze data. And I've also worked a lot as an applied scientist in a kind of mid-sized company building and helping improving products that use machine learning. And through this career, I've done a lot of mentoring, both as part of my job in academia, where you mentor bachelor and master students, and later on also PhD students, and you gain a lot of technical depth. But as you get a lot of technical depth, you run the risk of kind of like losing the sight of how to communicate your thoughts and ideas to everyone else. And that also means that as I went along this path, I noticed that the soft skills are actually what are important because the technical depth you get automatically as you do your work. And the soft skills, they don't come kind of as automatically and as much for free. So I mentor a lot on mentor crews, and career planning is a huge part of it. And what I will cover today is a bit how to plan for yourself, to kind of set the right goals. And I often see this as an exercise in communicating to yourself about yourself. Because if you can clearly express where you want to go, it's also much trickier to get there. And I'll cover some kind of skills that I think are important as you progress in a career about communicating and participating within the team. And we'll eventually hit a point where your technical skills and the non-technical skills kind of start diverging in their importance. As you start taking on leadership roles, it's still important to have good technical skills, but non-technical skills are becoming a lot more important to have the right impact and effect that you want to have. And going from kind of a leader to someone who leads cross-functionally, not just within one team, across multiple teams, or across teams of different functions, so like front-end, back-end, or machine learning and product, kind of the burden you have as a communicator and the burden you have on your soft skills become increasingly important. And that goes as you go beyond thinking about yourself as someone who communicates and has soft skills, but if you think about interacting and leading the team or an entire organization. And this planning for yourself, what do you want, is also typically a question I start with when I have a new mentee. And as I said, it's a communication exercise with yourself, and it's like essentially the question, can you express clearly what you want? And then can you write it down in a good format? So you can say, I want to be promoted is a goal, but it's a very weak goal because, like, what does it really mean? Where do you want to be promoted to? In what time frame? What type of promotion do you want? What effort do you want to put in to get there? So I often encourage people to write something like objectives and key results for themselves, or to use SMART goals. So something that's specific enough that you can measure, that's realistic enough, and that also has some time bound. And I also think in 30, 60, 90 days, which is often used when onboarding, right? Like in your first 90 days, I expect people to accomplish this and that, so I know it's a good hire and I can keep them working as part of the team. And it's often that people struggle doing that, not because they don't have goals or they don't have ambitions, but they haven't thought about expressing it clearly enough or making it really tangible for themselves to have these type of goals. And if you can't do that, it doesn't mean that you or the person you're working with lacks ambition, but they often lack the information, right? They are like, what is a realistic goal? What is specific enough? And what's achievable? That might mean people, especially more junior people, don't know enough about the possible career trajectories and how different careers start to diverge. Going from like a senior to a staff engineer is often a point in time where you also just stop being a senior and an individual contributor and you start going more into a management function. And these functions might also differ in different domains. That might be in part that different industries just have different terms for the same function. For example, a vice president might be a senior engineer somewhere else, and a director might be something else, because in banking they're often individual contributor directors versus in tech companies these are often leaders. And then it's also often that people just don't know in what aspect and how they can actually grow. I think that a lot of technical people have this instinct to learn more about technology, another programming language, more libraries, more in-depth information about algorithms, but that alone isn't enough to like plan your career and express where you want to go. So what can you do about that? Yourself and with people you might mentor in your organization. One exercise I really like and enjoy is doing a job review exercise by just telling someone that isn't quite sure where they want to go through a bunch of job descriptions of titles, of job titles that sound appealing to them. Because I mentor in machine learning, I often have software engineers who want to kind of push into machine learning or AI, and they don't know what is the difference between data science, MLOps, machine learning engineering, machine learning science. And what I often advise them is go to a job board, find 10, 15 jobs with the type of title you think is interesting, and pick out of the list the things of the responsibilities you find interesting, intriguing, and appealing, and just make a list and do that as things that you find less interesting and less appealing. And by doing that, you'll eventually find out what type of responsibilities and tasks sound appealing to you, and you can kind of like build towards that and set goals and say, someday I want to get there, and then start analyzing how do I get there. The same goes for career ladder and leveling information, especially as companies grow. You eventually find a matrix where there are responsibilities for junior, mid, senior staff, or principal engineers, both in terms of technical contribution, leadership contribution, contribution to the vision. So that's also a source where you can like draw from to say, oh, this sounds appealing, or I really want to avoid that, to like start setting goals for yourself, especially if you find the leveling information from your own company. GitLab has a lot of open source information, and there's a link where you can look up how they kind of aggregate and add responsibilities of different types as people grow the career ladder. I think that's a good way to like have someone who doesn't have direction find some direction where they want to go, or other where they don't want to go, where they would be unhappy because it's not the type of work they want to be doing. And then people who have been working for a while can also look into their reviews and their one-on-one meetings to figure out where is there a misalignment, or where there's opportunity to grow, where's the feedback falling that they get. And the other thing is you can often go to communities. There are a lot of large community Slacks for MLOps. There's a Slack you can find that has like 20,000 members, and just ask people for advice there. Describe where you are and kind of figure out where you want to go. I recently did this when I was thinking about learning more about product management. I found some community members who just told me about like how they got into product management, what their responsibilities are, how that aligns and overlaps with skills I have or don't have. And of course, you can find coaches or mentors that do that with you in a much more focused one-on-one way to figure out what is or what could be your career goal. And what I do on Mentor Course is often guide people through these steps to like help them find what they want to do. And what I often recommend is to actually make time for it and make this a conscious effort and not just kind of a byproduct of you doing good work. Because doing good work helps, but it doesn't help you getting anywhere specific. The same is if you have a goal, you need to be able to communicate it clearly, whether that's to your boss or to in a job interview to the people that are interviewing you. So writing your goals down in a good format also helps it to communicate it very well. And then what's very important, and whether that's a friend, a colleague, a mentor, is often ask for feedback and present and communicate. Right? So if you have written down some of your goals in form of an OKR or some type of SMART goal, don't just keep it for yourself and check it with yourself, but like you can tell someone and say like, hey, I'm thinking about this as my career goal. What do you think? does that make sense? Do you understand? Or ask like active listening wise, like, can you tell me where I'm trying to go? And if a person cannot repeat your goals that you described, then you will find it much harder to find someone within your organization to help you get there, because they're also very likely not understanding where you actually want to go. And I have some examples from my mentorship experience about these exercises. I had one mentee come from software engineering who wanted to kind of break into machine learning. And we did this exercise, especially the one with the job titles. And he eventually came back after like some days. I was like, I actually did this, and I realized like everything's really terrible right now. I think I'm just really burned out. I don't really need a career change. I'm just so annoyed by my daily work that I'm trying to find ways to get away from it. And he essentially ended up taking a short sabbatical before like kind of jumping back in with more energy, instead of trying to learn something new without real direction. So essentially, I didn't mentor him into the transition into machine learning as much as I helped him understand his own goal, which in this case was needing a break. And that these plans can help communicate clarity. I had another case where someone wanted to break into MLOps, and we made some plans. And using these plans and goals, he had kind of a top talking point when he went to meetups, and he was able to kind of convert the ability to clearly and precisely talk about where he wants to go to find someone who ended up offering him an interview and hiring him. And likewise, I had some people come to me who are essentially stuck in very senior positions on a staff or principal level, because they've been like trucking along at a company that was successful enough to offer them the growth opportunity that after like 5 years or 8 years in the company, they were kind of the principal engineer of that company, but they had no conscious goal, and eventually they needed to start looking around, and they were like kind of mismatched between where they wanted to be and where they had gotten, but everywhere they could go didn't seem as appealing because they already had achieved this kind of important function within their current company. And now in the following, I'll talk about some mostly communication skills and exercises that I think will help you both in doing this exercise and setting your own goals, as well as in kind of making progress towards your goals. Some of them are very simple, and kind of as the webinar progresses, I'll start talking about more tips that are more targeted to more senior people and to more leadership functions. And at the beginning, it's a bit more general. Of course, the good communication advice also applies to leaders, should apply to leaders, right? But we'd also assume that someone who already is a leader knows enough about it to justify being there. And one of the things coming from a very deep technical scientific perspective is that technical depth and domain expertise is actually dangerous when you want to communicate clearly, especially clearly with people that don't have the same technical depth, because you have all this jargon and hidden assumptions. Because sometimes I've seen that happen when people talk about things like requirements. In specific engineering fields, a requirement is a very tangible, specific thing. And to a normal person or someone coming from marketing or product or a leader person, they might not think about a requirement in the same concrete terms. And then there's a mismatch between what people are talking about. So it's always important to keep in mind that audiences and their attentions may vary. So in this case, someone might read or listen to you, but they don't want the full picture. They're just trying to get a high-level overview. And you might write a nice document, but people just skim it because they don't care about the exact details. And then often people might want to have something written down, but actually what they need are bullet points, or people want the short version of what you're having to say, not the 5-minute version, but the 30-second version. So as you use technical terms to find shortcuts, you also lose your audiences, even though you might accomplish very concise, effective communication to another domain expert. You might lose every other listener. And there are a couple of things that tech people don't do often enough. And that doesn't just extend to tech people. That's also often for other people who are kind of deep into their domain. So that, and some of these things are pitching, storytelling, writing, and using visual aids. And pitching is something I think is often associated with like startups and like kind of asking for money. But in general, this idea or concept of an elevator pitch where you use 30 to 60 seconds to concisely communicate the what, why, how to someone is a really good exercise. And I think every engineer, data scientist should practice breaking down what they want to share in a meeting, in a stand-up, not just in the version they have in their head, but like kind of make the effort to write a really short version and to write the longer version for themselves. Because the short version forces you to be much more clear about what's your key point, what can you leave out, and what can you not leave out. When you always only write the long version, you'll end up creeping in kind of not so necessary and important information. And the same goes for storytelling, kind of like not just aggregating information and dumping it on people, but like helping them to pay attention and understand it. And the same goes for writing. We might write some Jira tickets or some Slack messages, but like really writing down the what, why, when, how of an idea, for example, is something we should not just do when we're asked to do it, but we should consciously practice it. The same goes for visual aids, and that's extra important for data scientists, of course, choosing the right type of visualizations or graphs. But that also goes for general ideas. Often a mind map or some type of graph that shows how things are related can be very helpful to communicate an idea quickly and precisely. And that's something you can also practice for yourself. And just some pointers where you can find that besides talking to someone who mentors in these specific topics is, of course, most startup pitching sources you find actually have the key points that you really care about in it. So you can just find any of them and they will tell you, like, to construct a good pitch, you have a hook and you have these other points. And that's good enough to start doing it yourself. And the same goes for storytelling. For visualizations, it's often good to look at other people's work and you'll see what like stands out and what doesn't resonate with you. And the same goes for like more engineering focused documents like requests for comments or engineering blogs. You'll see that some of them clearly communicate not only what was done, but like why did they do that? How did they do that? What are the limitations? And as you start kind of paying attention to these things, and for example, reading a blog and then writing an elevator pitch for what was done and why did they do it and what did they accomplish, is a really good exercise to both check, did they actually communicate all these things? And did you also understand all these things for yourself? And that's what I meant by doing a lot of exercises. Doing is often better than reading. There are lots of great books, webinars, blogs out there that show and tell you how to improve your communication, your writing. But you need to do it because only by doing it you see where you fail, kind of implementing all the best practices. And if you actually are able to memorize and keep in mind all these tips you're getting, and even a pitch for the same thing as you repeat it will get better just through iteration. So grab some colleague or mentor, a coach, or a community member just to like give them a pitch to like check and say, I want to share this in the next team meeting. I just want to check if I have it down, and you have like a minute to listen to this and give me feedback whether you understand it or not. The same goes for active listening. So not just listening, but like repeating back to the speaker what you understood they're trying to say. You can do that with yourself, right? Write down your career goals and like then read them and try to rephrase them using the information that you have written down and see, is this actually including everything that I wanted to communicate? And what's also good is when you want to communicate and think about your own career is keeping a log of great things you've done, because we tend to forget all the good things we've done when things get busy. And then use a good format that like describes the situation, the task, the action, and the result about what you've done. And just by practicing this type of format, you also practice effective communication about yourself. I have an example from more of a like technical field. In machine learning, it's very easy to say, oh, we're going to train this new fancy deep learning model on this type of data. But this completely leaves to the listener to understand why you're doing that, what's the goal, what is in the data that makes you believe that this model is going to form better. And instead, you can invert it and say, there's a property in the data we can exploit to achieve something like better performance. And therefore, we're going to use this type of model. It's saying the same thing, but one makes it really clear why you're doing it and what to expect, and the other one doesn't. And as your career moves on, you kind of see this divergence between technical and non-technical skills. You can elevator pitch all the technical things, and you can like write concise requests for comments that are very clear, but kind of starting to lead people means you also need to interact with like non-technical people and also deal with people instead of with technologies. And leadership doesn't necessarily mean management or managing people. It can also mean just mentoring, which means just helping other technical members of your team to work better, or it can mean technical leadership, as in setting the direction, choosing the technologies, and being the one who kind of guides the technical work in the right direction without having to be responsible for the people who do it, right? So in contrast to the typical engineering manager who makes sure that people are happy, gives them like technical feedback, and is responsible for their growth. Lead engineers often don't have that responsibility, so they don't necessarily need to know how to give perfect growth feedback to others, but they still need to lead people and not just write a good technical document on how to accomplish the goals they have. And communicating as soon as you start taking on leadership positions means you communicate both to others, but also for others, right? You might speak for the team or for the technical direction that you and the team came up with. And that often means you should do things like note-taking, because you're no longer just listening and retaining what's important for you, but potentially what's important for others that you don't know is important. And if you don't take comprehensive notes, you might just forget that. The same goes for like structuring information and dependencies and things like mind maps, writing good summaries and like writing good pitches of the conclusions from a meeting. That these are all kind of soft skills that will help you, that very much exceed the scope of just technical information, because now it's in part about communicating technical information, but it's also getting people on board, making them understand why this is done and not just what has been done. And that also includes non-technical information like priorities or deadlines, which you also need to kind of communicate and defend at some point, even if you aren't the last instance to actually come up with them. And kind of as you get closer to your career goals, especially when they mean growing or leveling up, kind of non-technical skills and responsibilities come automatically with it. And my recommendation is to kind of make time to kind of understand the non-technical dimension of a project, to take responsibility and ownership, and also take kind of distracting things kind of seriously, like mentoring other team members that are maybe more junior or not delivering as much, because it's not as distracting as it seems, and it's also very useful to test your own soft skills and improve them. I had some examples in my own mentorship experience where I mentored an individual contributor who was offered the chance to step out as an engineering manager. But that also meant that suddenly he was seen as the one kind of speaking for and defending and also acting as a knowledge center for a lot of machine learning kind of facts or knowledge towards other team members, other leaders that he previously didn't speak to. And he also never had this responsibility of being the one person in the company who says that they, for example, shouldn't use this type of approach or that the other approach is better. And the same experience I had with a CTO who worked at a smallish company, but for purpose of planning and setting OKRs, they joined the product organization essentially. And there they needed to kind of combine both the language and the requirements and needs from a fast evolving technical field where things were moving really fast in AI and capacities, and what you could build quickly changed a lot, versus a product org which didn't think in technical terms. And that was a huge communication gap and a huge mismatch on how people were able to see eye to eye on what's possible, what should be planned, how things should be planned, and how things should be prioritized. And the last example also kind of highlights the next thing that will happen if you progress more in your career, and is something that you need to progress in your career, is when you think cross-functionally. So you might start as an individual contributor, you might work your way up in the team, you might eventually be a very senior member, but that means eventually your team is not enough anymore, and you need your impact will leave the team, and you suddenly start working with other people. And depending on the size of the company, these might be adjacent teams that do similar things. That's often in enterprise companies like this, where you maybe use an internal API as something where you essentially act as the client, or where you require another team to build something that you're going to use to build something. Often you start seeing that feature requests or entire products come from the product organization, and they need to be implemented on the technical side. And often sales or marketing are people you kind of communicate with about abilities or kind of missing things in the features that you have. And of course, leadership and product managers that think much further ahead than just the next quarter, for example. And then often customers or outside clients, especially when you build kind of enterprise products that start with a huge amount of consulting or customization during onboarding, you might suddenly speak and communicate with people that have not just a non-technical background, but also a very different view of the world in terms of what they care about. And it's an opportunity, even though the burden of communication always falls on you to make yourself understood. All these different perspectives can give you a good source for feedback, and it gives you the chance to pair up and get perspectives from someone you would not otherwise work with on your daily life. And getting a different perspective can be very helpful to make sure that your understanding is actually correct, or you see it from the right perspective. And there are a couple of resources that you usually always come across that you can use for that, besides talking to a mentor or career coach. Often companies do something called 360 feedback, or at least some peer feedback. In 360 feedback, you try to get feedback not just from your individual peers, but also from kind of above and below you, and potentially across teams and functions. And you can always ask people to say, I recently gave this presentation about the new thing we're building. Was it clear enough? Did everybody understand it? What do you think I could have done better? And people are usually very open to give you that feedback. You also can find a lot of information about how people think about a product you work on in these requests for comments or one pages or specification docs that were not written by your specific team organization, but someone else. So you might be implementing some type of API, but some product manager probably first said, what are we trying to build? And then someone kind of had to translate this into, these are the individual services we're going to build. But often this perspective gets lost, and you end up with a specification on what you should do, but not how it's going to be sold and what the intention behind the product is. And often you can find a lot of interesting people to talk to just by looking at your organization chart and the dependencies between the teams. You realize that there are people that work on very similar things or the same product just from a very different perspective that the organization just didn't let you meet. And then there are often type of service level agreements for technical products, where it's interesting to understand why do they exist, who came up with them, to have a better idea how things connect together. And there is an interesting value that a lot of companies have, which is something like customer first. And it's typically an encouragement, right, to not only build great products for the customer, but to also kind of align everyone in the company to think about the same thing, which is how do we help our customer? But that alone is not enough. And I have a good example of what can go wrong. I once worked with an enterprise insurance company, and we partnered up as an outside service provider with different teams. One of them was the customer support or happiness team, a specific engineering team that managed the service, the operations team, monitoring team that was essentially making sure everything runs smoothly, and then the owner of the specific business process that this service was implementing. And as I talked to all of them, I realized that they actually never sat down together. They all were talking kind of through documents handed on to kind of a management layer, and a lot of information got lost. So the engineering team was monitoring the app for the customer to provide best service, but they were not actually monitoring crucial steps that the business owners actually cared about, where they say the customers are doing this because they expect a certain value, not just a very accessible, fast responding app. There was a kind of communication and alignment gap, even though everybody had the customer's benefit in mind, essentially. And the last thing that I kind of want to touch on before I open up for questions is we've seen, or I've talked about how to go from kind of communication closer towards leadership, closer towards things that you encounter when you think cross-functionally. The last thing is, at some point, it kind of like leaves the scope of you and your understanding and your communication, and you need to communicate kind of for others and kind of motivate them. And at some point, you reach a point where I think it's a lot where it's a mindset. It's not necessarily your mindset and how you go through your daily life, but how you communicate your information. For example, resilience and positive framing in leadership. When things go wrong, you shouldn't be dishonest about them and lie about them, but you should still communicate them and find the positive kind of angle or framing for it to kind of keep people engaged and motivated, not just frustrated. And that's often tricky. When you're frustrated, it's easy to kind of transport this frustration to others and communicate that. But it's not really what people in a team need, right? The same goes for long-term and bigger picture thinking. Often you kind of think about things in a scope that go beyond even your own career impact, right? You try to make things potentially easier or set them up for people that you don't know, that are not part of your organization yet, but that might exist in the future if this grows. So there's something where you need to kind of force yourself to think outside kind of your immediate interest. And the same goes for tasks that are like influencing without having the actual authority, which is often a problem in cross-functional, cross-team communication, where you have an adjacent team and you need the API, but you're kind of in a parallel position, so you can't kind of order them to do things, but you still want them to do things. And there are things like empathy, finding and building allies, and having a low ego that help doing that. And a lot of them are essentially related to good communication. You can express empathy with clear communication, with active listening. You can find and build allies by being a good communicator, by being consistently clear, by essentially having transparent enough communication that people know you're reliable, and you also, when you have a low ego, don't take things personally. You kind of build trust with your team that you're not the first one to throw them under the bus, which even if that's not your intention, right, that's something you have to communicate effectively, that essentially start leaving the scope of your own career, your own plan, and communication for yourself. At that point, I'm open to questions. And otherwise, you can find me and my profile on Mentor Cruise. I have also a short URL down here, mentors.to/Chris-machine-learning, where you can find me. I do focus on mentoring machine learning and data science when it comes to technical mentorship, but when it comes to soft skills, I've mentored some people working at the intersection of CTO and product. I have mentored engineering managers. I've mentored people who are trying to do career transitions, and we're trying to kind of find their right fit. So the topics are not just on kind of the hardcore machine learning science, but also on these like kind of soft aspects I've been talking about. And at this point, I'm interested to see if there are any open questions. Okay, I have one question here that is, for someone studying the career in machine learning, what soft skills would you recommend to prioritize in developing? And I think when you come into machine learning, there are kind of two things are important, which I think is a clear ability to communicate what you're doing and why, instead of focusing on the how. So like, what's your assumption you're making, what you're expecting to exploit, and how do you expect to get there? And then having, because that makes it much easier for the listener to understand not just that you're doing something, but like where you're coming from. And I think for someone who's new in the field, it's tricky because the tools are new, but at the same time, you often communicate these things to people who also don't really understand the tools. So it's kind of important to take a step back and be able to formulate things in a kind of general enough language for people to understand. And the same goes then when you have done all the things to communicate the results. And especially in machine learning, where you have kind of metrics to measure results, like F1 score, accuracy, you can use these terms, but they're often not that meaningful or intuitive for people who don't work with them regularly. So it's much better to kind of rephrase this into a more understandable language and practice that part. So I think soft skill-wise, just communicating the intention of experiments, the outcome of experiments in like a good, clear, non-technical language will help a lot. And then a very related question is, for someone transitioning from software engineering to machine learning, what soft skills are crucial for a successful shift? And I think what's important here is, well, there's a technical aspect of it, right? Like being able to know where you're transitioning to. But the more crucial part is, I think, when you do the shift and you're looking for a position, it's like, how do you kind of describe your motivation, and how do you make your previous skills and experiences relevant and tangible to where you want to land, right? If you're a senior software engineer, you don't necessarily are a junior data scientist or machine learning person. If you have the right technical skills, clearly you lack some experience, but you have a lot of transferable experience. And communicating these things successfully, I think, is much more important than like yet another like kind of centimeter of depth in your technical knowledge. Okay, there are some more questions. One question is, what impact do the developments in large language models or GPT have on machine learning as a career or for career changers? I think that's a very interesting question, because it's not quite clear to me how this really will shape out. We have a lot of cool tools that kind of try to do and automate data analysis for yourself that help write you code. And we've had a couple of kind of similar trends before. There's a whole subfield called automatic machine learning that kind of try to take the human out of the loop when it comes to finding good models. And they also haven't managed to completely remove data scientists. And I think the same goes for these kind of GPTs for code creation. They help you be faster and more effective. But if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't understand the code that's being created, that often is very buggy or misses some edge cases, then it's not really accelerating you. It's more of a hindrance. So I think for career changes, it's a bit tricky, because a lot of the like early stage work would often start with like some boilerplates and easy apps. These are all tasks GPTs can do, but they're actually more impactful helping a person who already knows what they're doing to like be faster with tasks that they might not do every day. And for software engineers or machine learning people, this also, I think, goes into writing documentation, writing summaries, making code kind of prettier once they have conceptualized it, rather than like going from kind of end to end from here's a problem, here's a solution. What I think is important for people is that they know how to use these tools, right? Like ignoring, for example, tools like Copilot, I think that's not helpful and will backfire, whether you're a career changer or not. Okay, there's another question that says, do you think it's still valuable to do a PhD in machine learning to pursue a career as a machine learning research scientist? I think that's a very interesting question. And I would say it really depends both on where you want to go within ML research in a career and on where you are and what support system you have. If you want to break into it kind of from scratch, getting a PhD can be a kind of very straightforward avenue to get there. But at the same time, not every PhD ends up in a research career. And in fact, most PhDs, I would argue, even in machine learning, don't really end up in a real research career. Because research positions, even within companies, are somewhat rare. And if you look at how the large companies that hire research engineers hire, it's still often through the network. So just having a PhD is often not enough. You need like letters of recommendation from 2 or 3 peers on the right publications. So having a PhD can be helpful. I don't think it's a requirement to do good research, and there are lots of examples of people, especially if you look at the whole LLM GPT thing, where people didn't have PhDs or left their PhD to work on these things. At the same time, there are a lot of skills that you learn during a PhD that are very helpful when it comes to designing experiments, knowing when to stop, how to kind of follow up with good hypotheses. But these are also skills you can learn when you seek them out from an existing research team. And I think the bigger hurdle to having a good career or an interesting career as a research scientist is to find the right company to work for rather than to do just, in quotes, a random PhD. Okay, let's see if there are any more questions. Awesome. As far as I can see, there are no more questions. So thank you for listening. I would recommend that everyone check out Mentor Cruise, whether it's my profile or other profiles. There are a lot of really helpful, cool people out there. So thank you very much for tuning in.